They say the woods hold secrets, some beautiful, others terrifying. What you're about to hear are 3 bone-chilling, true camping horror stories that will make you think twice before stepping into the wild again. Welcome to Goat's Actions, where we uncover the unknown. Let's dive right in. But a warning, these stories may haunt you long after the campfire dies out. The woods had always been a sanctuary for Liam, Rachel, Eric, and Jenny. The 4 friends shared a love for adventure, and every summer they made it a tradition to escape the chaos of city life and immerse themselves in the serenity of nature. This year they decided to camp deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, a sprawling wilderness known for its dense trees, winding trails, and eerie legends. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, filled with laughter and the excited buzz of what lay ahead. They arrived just before sunset, setting up their tents and arranging a cozy campfire in the clearing. As twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the forest came alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping crickets. The atmosphere was perfect. By the time night fell, the campfire was blazing, and the group was lost in their usual banter, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. The mood was light, and the woods, though vast and imposing, felt like a world of their own. But as the evening wore on, the laughter began to wane, and the stillness of the forest became more noticeable. It was then that they heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. The sound came from the edge of the clearing, where the darkness swallowed the light of the campfire. The group fell silent, their eyes darting toward the shadows. Out of the blackness stepped a man. He was tall and lanky, with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a tattered jacket and his boots caked in mud. But what struck them the most was his smile, wide, almost too wide, and utterly unsettling. "Evening," he said, his voice rough but cheerful. "Didn't mean to startle you folks. Name's David. I'm just passing through. Got a little lost, thought I saw your fire." Rachel was the first to speak, her voice steady but polite. Hi, David. Are you camping out here alone?" David nodded, stepping closer to the fire. "Sure am. Been hiking these woods for days now. Got turned around when the sun went down. Mind if I warm up for a bit?" The group exchanged glances. There was an unspoken unease that none of them could quite articulate. But it was late, and the man seemed harmless enough. Reluctantly, Liam gestured to the fire. "Yeah, sure. Take a seat." David lowered himself onto one of the logs they'd arranged around the fire. He pulled out a battered tin mug from his jacket and held it over the flames, pretending to warm something invisible. For a moment, the group tried to resume their conversation, but David's presence was like a shadow looming over them. He didn't say much, only observing with that unnerving smile. It wasn't long before he began asking questions. Odd questions. "Ever seen a bear out here?" he asked, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Eric chuckled nervously. "No, not yet, and honestly I'd like to keep it that way." David nodded slowly, as if considering the response. You think a bear would come if you screamed loud enough?" The question hung in the air like smoke, choking the mood. Jenny shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others. Rachel cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "Well, hopefully we won't need to test that theory." David's smile faltered for the first time. His eyes, now shadowed and hard, locked onto Rachel. "Yeah, hopefully." The group tried to move on, asking David about his hike, but his answers were vague and evasive. He said he'd come from not far and planned to keep moving in the morning. When they asked about his gear or campsite, he brushed off the questions, redirecting the conversation with unsettling precision. Eventually, David stood, stretching. "Well, I've taken enough of your time. I'll let you folks enjoy your night. My camp's just up the trail. Thanks for the company." before anyone could respond, he disappeared into the darkness as abruptly as he had appeared. The group sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly. "Well, that was weird," Eric muttered, breaking the tension. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, weird is an understatement." The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but an air of unease lingered. When morning came, they decided to search for David's campsite before heading out. Curiosity mixed with an unspoken need for closure drove them into the woods. But as they combed the area, it became clear there was no campsite. No tent, no fire pit, no belongings. The only thing they found was a tree at the edge of their clearing. Carved into its bark were the words, "You're not alone." The group stood frozen, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Liam finally broke the silence. "Let's get out of here. Now." They packed up their gear in record time, their eyes constantly scanning the trees as if David might emerge at any moment. By the time they reached their car, the relief was palpable. But as they drove away, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Over the years, they tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe David had been a drifter, someone who lived off the grid. Maybe he'd intentionally avoided leaving tracks. But the questions lingered. How had he found their camp so easily? Why were there no footprints? And most haunting of all, how had he carved those words into the tree without them hearing a sound? To this day, none of them have returned to Blackwood Forest. But sometimes, late at night, they'll dream of a wide, unsettling smile and a voice that whispers, "You're not alone." Lisa and Maya had been best friends since childhood, their bond forged over countless adventures and shared dreams. This year, their wanderlust had brought them to Crescent Lake, a secluded spot nestled deep within the heart of Whispering Pines Forest. It was said to be untouched by modern life, a place where nature thrived in its purest form. They couldn't resist the allure of a weekend escape, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The drive to the lake had been long but scenic, winding through dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time they arrived, the sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the shimmering lake. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. They pitched their tent near the water's edge, setting up a small campsite with a fire pit and folding chairs. It was idyllic. The day passed like a dream. They fished in the lake, catching just enough for dinner, and explored the surrounding trails, marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. By dusk, they were seated by a crackling fire, the warm glow reflecting off their faces as they roasted marshmallows and shared stories. The forest, though vast and imposing, felt like their own private sanctuary. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep indigo, the atmosphere began to shift. The lively chirping of birds and rustling of leaves gave way to an eerie stillness. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lisa and Maya exchanged uneasy glances, but brushed off the feeling. After all, it was just the two of them out here, wasn't it? By the time they crawled into their sleeping bags, the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was shrouded in darkness. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore and the occasional hoot of an owl. Exhausted from the day's activities, they drifted into a light sleep. Lisa was the first to wake. At first, she wasn't sure what had roused her, but then she heard it. Faint whispers just outside the tent. Her heart began to race. She strained to listen, hoping it was just the wind, but the whispers grew clearer. They weren't random noises, they were words. And they were calling their names. Lisa, Maya, come out. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. She shook Maya awake, her trembling hand clamping over her friend's mouth to keep her silent. Maya's eyes widened as she too heard the whispers, the sound chilling them to their core. "Lisa, Maya, come out." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was otherworldly, as if it came from the trees themselves. They huddled together, paralyzed by fear, unwilling to move or make a sound. The whispers continued, growing fainter, as if whoever or whatever was speaking was walking away. Just as relief began to wash over them, a loud, deliberate scratch ran along the side of the tent. It was slow, methodical, and unmistakable. Then came the laughter, soft, almost playful, but deeply unsettling. It sent shivers down their spines. Gathering what little courage she could muster, Lisa reached for the flashlight. She unzipped the tent ever so slightly, just enough to shine the beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense trees and underbrush. But there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of life, just the still, silent forest. "Do you see anything?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. Lisa shook her head, her grip tightening on the flashlight. "Nothing, but I swear, something was out there." They spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching each other for comfort. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches set their nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, they emerged from the tent, their eyes scanning the forest for any signs of the night's intruder. The morning light brought some comfort, but the unease lingered. "We need to pack up and leave," Maya said, her voice firm. "I don't care if it's early. I don't want to spend another night here." Lisa nodded in agreement. They hurried to dismantle their campsite, throwing their belongings into their backpacks with frantic energy. But just as they were about to leave, Maya let out a blood-curdling scream. "Lisa, look." Lisa turned to see what had caused her friend's outburst. Her heart dropped. Surrounding their campsite, carved deep into the bark of the trees, were strange symbols. They looked like eyes, dozens of them, all staring down at them. The carvings were precise and fresh, the wood around them still raw and oozing sap. How did we not hear this?" Lisa stammered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Maya replied, her eyes darting nervously between the symbols and the trees beyond. "But we need to go. Now." They sprinted back to their car, their footsteps crunching loudly against the forest floor. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and every shadow seemed to shift and move. By the time they reached the safety of the vehicle, they were both breathless and on the verge of tears. As they drove away, the dense trees of Whispering Pines Forest loomed on either side of the road, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The symbols, the whispers, the laughter, it all played over and over in their minds. What had they encountered? Who or what had been out there with them? Neither of them could answer those questions. But one thing was certain, the forest was alive, and it had been watching them. To this day, Lisa and Maya refuse to talk about that night in detail. They've never returned to Crescent Lake or Whispering Pines Forest. But sometimes late at night, Lisa swears she can still hear it. A faint whisper on the wind, calling her name. Jake had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of the wilderness. While others found peace in bustling cities or social gatherings, Jake found his solace deep within the embrace of nature. For him, solo camping wasn't just a hobby, it was a ritual. The silence of the woods, the canopy of stars above, the distant hoots of owls, all of it brought him a sense of calm that nothing else could. This time, Jake decided to venture deeper than he ever had before. He'd researched a remote spot in the heart of Redwood National Park, far from the usual trails and campsites. It was a place untouched by the crowds, where he could immerse himself entirely in the untamed wild. He packed his gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a reliable flashlight, food rations, and his trusty knife, just in case. As he drove to the trailhead, the scenery transformed. The towering trees grew denser, their ancient trunks cloaked in moss. The narrow road wound through the forest like a serpent, flanked by shadows that stretched endlessly. Jake felt a thrill of excitement coursing through him. This was exactly what he needed, a true escape. By the time he reached the secluded spot he'd chosen, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. He quickly set up his tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering redwoods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches forming a natural cathedral above. Jake gathered firewood and soon had a campfire crackling merrily, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. As night fell, the forest came alive with its usual symphony, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Jake sat by the fire, sipping coffee from his tin mug, completely at peace. He leaned back against a log, staring up at the stars peeking through the gaps in the canopy. Out here, miles away from civilization, the night sky was a masterpiece. But as the hours passed, the lively hum of the forest began to fade. The crickets grew silent, the rustling stopped, and an eerie stillness settled over the clearing. Jake noticed it almost immediately. He sat up, his senses suddenly on high alert. It was unusual for the woods to fall completely silent. Something must have caused it. That's when he heard it. A faint crunch. The sound of dry leaves being stepped on. It came from somewhere behind him, just beyond the firelight's reach. Jake froze, straining his ears. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly human. Probably just an animal, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the tree line. The beam illuminated trunks and underbrush, but there was nothing unusual. No glowing eyes of a curious raccoon or deer, just shadows and more shadows. Shrugging, Jake settled back by the fire, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The crunching sound came again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. Jake spun around, flashlight in hand, but again, there was nothing. The forest seemed to mock him with its stillness. By midnight, the unease had grown into a gnawing fear. The crunching sounds continued intermittently, always from different directions, as if something or someone was circling his camp. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another camper? A hunter? But this deep in the woods, miles from any marked trail, the chances of encountering another person were slim. Finally, Jake decided to call it a night. He doused the fire, its embers hissing in protest, and retreated into his tent. He zipped up the flap and secured it, his knife within arm's reach. As he lay in his sleeping bag, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. The forest was playing tricks on him, amplifying his imagination. But then, something pressed against the fabric of the tent. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The pressure was subtle at first, like a hand gently brushing against the nylon. Then, it grew more deliberate, a firm press right near his head. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat up, gripping the knife tightly. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no response. The pressure vanished, leaving the tent flapping gently in the breeze. Jake held his breath, listening intently. For a moment, all was quiet. Then came a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a chuckle. It was low and guttural, barely audible, but it sent chills racing down his spine. Jake unzipped the tent slightly and shone his flashlight into the darkness. The beam swept across the clearing, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. No movement, no footprints. Just the empty forest staring back at him. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. Jake lay awake, clutching his knife, every rustle and creak sending his heart racing. When dawn finally broke, he emerged from the tent, exhausted but determined to investigate. What he found made his blood run cold. Around the tent, the ground was marked with footprints, human footprints. They were large and unmistakable, circling the tent multiple times. But the strangest part was that there were no tracks leading away. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had been there had simply vanished into thin air. Jake didn't waste another second. He packed up his gear in record time, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt oppressive, its towering trees like silent witnesses to something sinister. By the time he reached his car, his hands were trembling. As he drove away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow on the road, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made his heart leap. Even now, years later, he still has nightmares about that night. The chuckle, the footprints, the unseen stalker, memories that refuse to fade. Jake hasn't camped alone since. There you have it. 3 disturbing true camping horror stories that prove the wilderness can hold more than just beauty. Which one gave you the chills? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another eerie adventure on Goat's Actions. Until next time, stay safe and maybe stick to campgrounds with Wi-Fi.